Bienvenue au CCA. Je suis Kim Förster, directeur associé de la recherche ici au CCA. And tonight we have part two of a public event that we organize in connection with our toolkit for today's seminar. And I would like to especially welcome our guest speaker, Albena Yaneva. In the framework of our doctoral students program during the summer, the CCA invites scholars to reveal their tools, concepts, methods, and reflect on them in a convivial atmosphere. The 2017 toolkit was on oral history, and it closed today, and it considered the potentials and challenges of this method for its use for history and criticism as a source of information or as a way to collect evidence otherwise difficult to grasp or witness. We had two seminars organized as moments when the week-long discussion breaks through the surface and emerges in public. And for the toolkit which we ran during this last week, we invited Janina Gosset, together with her colleague, collaborator, and co-editor Naomi Stead, to conceive and moderate reading and workshop sessions. On Tuesday night, they presented their approach towards a theoretization of oral history in architecture under the banner Alternative Facts, as well as a book project entitled Speaking of Buildings, in dialogue with one of their authors, Thomas Bernard Kniff. For tonight, we then invited Albena Yaneva, who will present her ongoing research, which is 2 years lasting, into CCA's archival, curatorial, and editorial practice from within, informed by an oral history in combination with what she calls slow ethnography, based on fieldwork and observation with regard to the hidden life of objects in the vaults, in the conservation lab, the offices, and the galleries. To the CCA, the method of oral history is of interest not only for an institutional history encompassing so far the story of its foundation, but as a research institution and museum, all of our divisions, collection, programs, publication, and research work with interviews and more specifically oral history. Besides, oral history poses methodological questions to architecture history with regard to memory and the everyday, evidence and narrative, authorship, collaboration, subjectivity and gender, relationships and power, etc. Just as a brief biographical information, Albena Yaneva is a professor of architectural theory and director of the Manchester Architecture Research Group at the University of Manchester. In the past, she has been visiting professor at Princeton School of Architecture and at Parsons. And this year, she was awarded the Lise Meitner Visiting Chair in Architecture at the University of Lund in Sweden. Trained as an anthropologist of architecture, holding a PhD from École Nationale Supérieure des Mines de Paris, her research is intrinsically transdisciplinary and crosses the boundaries of science studies, cognitive anthropology, architectural theory, and political philosophy. She's the author of several books, so for example, The Making of a Building in 2009, Made by OMA, an ethnography of design, also in 2009, Mapping Controversies in Architecture in 2012, 5 Ways to Make Architecture Political, and Introduction to the Politics of Design Practice, published this year, and as an editor, What is Cosmopolitical Design in 2015. After the presentation, I have asked Janina Gosset to provide the first response with regard to institutional storytelling, so the title of today's seminar, followed by a Q&A then. So please join me now in welcoming tonight's speaker, Albena Yaneva.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. And to see some of the people I have worked with and interviewed here in the CCA, so it's really a pleasure. And I would like to say today I'll be presenting work in progress, and I would have never agreed to do this if it were not for Mirko, Giovanna, and all the people and the fascinating work that you're doing here in this institution. So before I start, I would like to talk about the methods that I have been using in my work, which are methods I will sum up with two words, quick and slow methods, or there are two epistemological positions. In architectural history and theory, we often engage in quick experimentations, quick explorations of architectural works, phenomena, and buildings. We visit a building, and my first picture sort of captures this quick visit, and it could be any building. We visit an architectural practice or an institution like the CCA, or an archive if we are historians, and then we make a quick interview, a couple of pictures, we collect a couple of materials, and then we go back home. So this epistemological position, the quick one, is reminiscent to the one of a hasty sightseer that walks in a city and then just takes pictures, whose experience mimics the one of a racing car driver, I would say, traveling across the fields and seeing but the fleeting landscapes from a distance. A quick visit will provide an impression of architecture, but hardly an experience of it. Going home, we will become also hasty writers and will produce a quick account by reconnecting the materials from the quick visits, the quick studies, reconnecting them with literature on architecture, the relevant history, the quick concepts in architectural theory. However, such a swift and partial perception will inevitably limit any theory of it. The interpretation will be analytical and one-sided. As a hasty sightseer, we will begin to replace the missing experience of a building, a process, or an institution with unrelated notions and concepts coming from other worlds, the world of theory, the world of concepts. The theorizations will define random equivalent relationships between architectural works and larger frameworks, the larger frameworks of society, culture, symbols, and these interpretations will rely on rigid conceptualizations of styles, languages, and typologies. There is, however, another way to engage with architecture, the slow one, which will correspond to the second epistemological position. And as a slow researcher, and this is me, you understood that that's the position I endorse, I can visit a building, an institution like the CCA, an architectural practice like OMA, for instance, and I will visit this institution or this practice more often. And I will try to understand the reality of the practice, the ontology of the objects that I interact with, carefully keeping a diary, interviewing, observing, documenting, and tracing different activities, movements, and gestures. Exploring a building, and again, you can think of a building, you can look at the building on the picture, but you can think of the other examples. Exploring a building through repeated visits, I will be able to experience its various speeds and intensities. The changing moods of crowds, of people, and flows of things, the different atmospheres and events. Exploring a practice or an institution as a slow ethnographer, I can witness the daily process of work through interviews and ethnographic observation, following the process slowly as it unfolds, trying to observe and make sense of what I see, tracing the trajectories, the events, the happenings, I gain experience. So this will make my theory different. It is this rich experience that will form the core of my interpretations. This should be, I will argue here, the foundation for architectural theory, and the only foundation for architectural theory, according to me. Historical and cultural information, of course, can throw light on a building, an institution or a practice, but they cannot substitute the understanding of the architectural object or process in their own qualities and relations. The epistemology of the slow ethnographer, of the slow researcher, relies on presence and immediacy and helps us to understand the specificity of various architectural objects and institutions and not to replace them with the quick concepts of society and culture like a hasty sightseer will do. As an anthropologist trained by Bruno Latour, I often engaged in slow ethnography of architecture, and in the last 16 years I have studied different practices, and I focus mainly on the practices and beliefs of different institutions and different tribes of designers, just like an anthropologist who will live on an island and try to understand the cultures, the beliefs, and the exotisms of a very specific tribe of practitioners. And here I'm using tribe in the sense of Bruno Latour as a modern tribe. I lived with tribes such as the Oime, Moshe Safdie's practice, Alejandro Zerapolo's practice, and others, and living with this practices, learning from their cultures and exotisms as I did, I was interested in understanding their strange obsession with time, novelty, and innovation, their enigmatic attachments to models, to drawings, sketches, and software, and the extraordinary inconsistency in how they define themselves and their practices. Driven by the ambition to engage in a critique of architectural practice from within, I devoted many different fieldworks questioning what matters to architects and what truly defines their worlds. I focused on the process, always on the process, on the materials and the ontology of design practice and the politics of design, and developed an anthropological approach to architecture inspired by actor network theory. That is also an approach that follows the principle of no hierarchy and symmetry, which means I try to notice everything that happens in the context of practitioners, and everything that happens between humans and models, humans and non-humans, architects and models, giving undivided attention also to words and the gestures and the non-verbal language, discourses, the discursive and the non-discursive information that we get when we gain experience in a practice. That is an approach that pays attention also to the texture of ordinary life of institutions and practitioners. This work was also inspired by the writings of Dana Kaff, Don O'Shawn, and this tradition, American tradition of anthropology, of design, and I think that the reintroduction of ethnographic methods into architecture, some 30 years after the pioneering work of Dana Kaff holds remarkable potential to investigate new questions in architecture. And I think this can contribute to dislodge the certainty of traditional architectural knowledge and the belief placed in the absolute authority of historical archives in architectural research at the moment. Architectural research is often reduced to the production of critical discourse about practices, but there is little interest in accounting the practices of designing architects, of the practices of archive making, like what happens in this institution. Recently, I found myself as a slow researcher, as a slow ethnographer in the CCA. I engaged in slow ethnography of the practices of archive making, the curatorial and and archival practice of this institution. Architectural archives, we know it all, and the CCA does not need to be introduced in this context today, as you're all familiar with what the CCA importance in the contemporary galaxy of architectural theory and history, and in the contemporary research landscape, as either as researchers, as students, or as people working in this fantastic institution. So I see a lot of people I have interviewed. While the history and politics of established archives is tackled in architecture, in the architectural literature, the process of making archives has not been explored. Analysis of what it means to be an archivist of architecture and what it means to produce an archive in architecture tend to come from the archivists themselves rather than from professional architects and architectural theorists. So tracing the way architectural objects and models and documents become archival units, or the becoming archival of architectural object, is what interests me, and this tracing requires us to pay close attention to the ways in which practicing architects understand their worlds, and to the ways in which we acquire knowledge about the worlds through the architectural objects that remain and become archival. My interest, therefore, is not in the visible CCA, the CCA that you all know in one or another way, with this fantastic building, the CCA that we see, and the CCA and its research spaces, the office spaces, the different exhibits and events that you have seen. But I'm rather interested in the invisible CCA and the secret life of objects, drawings, archives in this institution. So the questions that I would like to answer is, to what extent do architectural archives reflect the nature of design as a collective endeavor? Does thought of future history redound upon the past, the present? How do practices of arranging, cataloging, archiving, numbering, and taking care of objects, practices of preserving, conserving, repairing, maintaining, produce structuring effects in an archive? How do these effects happen to shape knowledge and generate meaning? So to answer these questions, and these are some of the questions I have, because there are much more questions, as I said, this is work in progress. To answer those questions, I draw on oral, I wouldn't call it oral history, I would say in-depth interviews, which might have the flavor of oral history, but also ethnographic observation of some daily practices at the CCA. This, of course, means following, not just sitting in a room like this and interviewing people, but also following curators, conservators, catalogers, archivists, technicians, register people, and many other practitioners in this institution, also trying to account for the material and cognitive dimensions of their work, trying to understand what they mean when they say they're cataloging, what they mean when they say they're curating a new exhibit. So trying to relate discursive with non-discursive knowledge. This also meant for me also visiting their working spaces, the labs, the offices, the vaults, the exhibits, the studios and the workshops, and also shadowing them in different activities. So I visited the vaults, different archives. I looked at I traced the arrival of scissor and look at, sorry, some of you are on the pictures, others are not, so I apologize. I didn't know who will attend the lecture. And not all the pictures are beautiful, sorry about this. They're very research type of images. So I followed the different, so this is, for instance, the arrival of scissor and how the scissor collection is being cataloged and rehoused some of the specific objects and drawings. I visited the register to look at some of the discussions that also were of curatorial discussions that you see here on this image that happen in the register, but also I met register people and interviewed them as well in their spaces. Yeah, here they are. And trying to trace also the different trajectories of objects through those spaces. So all these spaces are rarely seen by people visiting the exhibits, by the researchers and the PhD students. This is, for me, the invisible CCA. I also looked at the conservation lab, visited the votes, looked at some of the working process and the curatorial discussions at the moment when Giovanna, I see Lev here in the room, and other people working in collaboration with Giovanna were preparing the other architect, the exhibit The Other Architect, and I zoomed into specific curatorial discussions also to understand how the curatorial decisions will connect to the collection and the philosophy of the institution, the choice of the objects and the discussions around these choices, and of course I visited different exhibits over the period of 2 years. I focused on different objects. Some of those objects were extremely fascinating for me to see. So for instance, this is the Fun Palace model of Cedric Price, and I was interested in tracing the different travels of the objects and how they become entitled to speak on behalf of an architect or on behalf of the CCA, and how they travel. I looked at specific events as well. I was interested in the cataloging, the work of cataloging, the decision-making process and how it connects to very specific strategical decision. And I also looked at the workshop in the preparation of the exhibit and the specific work on the objects before they go up in the exhibition rooms. So this gives you an idea of the different spaces where ethnographic work and oral histories were collected, and the scope of the research as well. So 2 years of studying the CCA, not continuously, because I came here for short visits, so I studied this through short visits for interviews and some observations. So this 2 years convinced me that it was impossible to treat this particular fieldwork, this particular case study as a separate one, in isolation from other ethnographic sites I have studied before. So during my ethnography of architectural practices, and I think in particular the longest ethnographic work I have done, which is in the practice of Koolhaas in OMA, during this study a number of key themes emerged. For instance, how participants in design share agency with models, form models in particular in this practice, how content and context mutate as design develops, how architectural cognition happens on table of models and drawings, not in the designer's mind, how creative messiness is not random but generates meaning, and many other issues. During my short visits in the CCA, some of these themes re-emerged. The OMA and the OMA fieldwork started talking back to me. So this connection with the design practices that I have traced before emerged and became important. And I didn't want to mobilize this knowledge, but I started mobilizing it because it just interfered in the work, in the study here. So I started, of course, questioning the role of the status of transparticular knowledge, how we connect different cases, how the dialogue between cases happens, and how the knowledge travels from case to case. And it was, of course, not surprising that the OMA, the presence of the OMA design ethnography was so strong, because it was, for me, the longest fieldwork I have done before, a fieldwork that taught me architecture more than any school could do, and was also very formative for me as an anthropologist, because it helped me to also fine-tune my methods. In a way, the importance of OMA here was also re-emerged in discussions with Giovanna and Mirko, because they knew my previous work, but it was also a discussion that was very present in the ethnographic observation of the different labs and the different sites of knowledge production in the CCA. On a methodological note, the kind of ethnography I do, again, I wouldn't call it oral history, but it contains history, is an interest, and I'm paraphrasing Clifford Geertz here, it's an interest not in the theorists and the ideologists of architects, but it's an interest in the practices. Ethnography is it's about what practitioners do. The methodology I followed contained semi-structured interviews, and the genre of these interviews changed and also varied according to the different people I interviewed, but it also contained informal chats and conversations, sometimes in the corridor, so maybe you didn't know that I was interviewing you, and that when we exchange information in the kitchen, this was interesting knowledge for me as well. Participant observation in different situations, but also archival research, different visits, and also photo documentation, images, diagrams, and other sources. I would like to now take you through different scenes to illustrate the approach, because we're in a method seminar here, but also to give you a flavor of some of the findings. And as I said, these are pretty much working findings. And I would like to welcome all sorts of comments and, of course, disagreements. Because I've never presented my OMA ethnography in OMA. I was telling this Giovanna. So I really admire the courage of Mirko and Giovanna of inviting me today to present some of these findings. This is really brave, and thank you. So I would like to take you through 3 very short walks in the hidden CCA, but maybe you have seen it, because the PhD students were telling me in the afternoon that you had a visit, you had a guided tour. So perhaps you already know some of these labs and some of those hidden spaces. But let me take you through 3 very brief walks and tell you what I have seen there. Montreal, 2014, I'm in the CCA on the occasion of the pre-release of the documentary of Francesco, Misleading Innocence. I didn't even plan to do any research on the CCA at that time, so it was my first visit for a talk, and Giovanna kindly offered us a guided tour in the vaults. I remember this moment of silence, the space of the darkness of the vaults, the sparkling floors, clinically clean, dark and shiny corridors. And we enter, after walking through these corridors, we enter the lit vaults, and the silence gets interrupted by the chatter of archivists gathered around the table. On that table, I glance at some drawings, and I say to myself, wow, it's very familiar. And before I even finish mind whispering it, I realize I'm asking out loud, are these the Chandigarh, and I can barely breathe, I can barely finish my sentence, drawings, and my voice trembles, of Le Corbusier. And well, this is one of the drawings. It's not actually the real one. I couldn't take pictures. But I remember my fingers shivering in excitement, and as I imagine reaching towards the drawings and touching them. Yes, touching them. The silence is interrupted again, and by an energetic, the silence this time is interrupted by an energetic and a collective no. And my descending hands freeze, and my architecturally misled brain rebuffs any further thoughts. I can't follow. I'm lost. So it was this kind of clean space in the vaults, and people were gathered around the table like this one, although this is not the specific situation I followed, and the drawings were there. But what I remember, I remember the setting. I couldn't take pictures, as I said, that's why I used these images, but I can still hear this no, and I remember the no. And what does, well, I'm over-dramatizing the no here for the purposes of this lecture, but I would like to reflect on what this no means in a context of an institution like the CCA. And that moment at the votes made visible for me as an anthropologist the existence of a particular gathering of things, archivists, curators, catalogers, like what you see on these pictures, and visitors like myself and like yourself here tonight. This gathering of people around objects, this assembly of people and objects is something that we rarely conceptualize. This gathering is reminiscent to a society of friends of architecture object, and here by society of friends I refer to Miguel Tamen's work. This is a special grouping around these precious objects or precious drawings. We gather around the objects of importance to the community of architects, believing that these objects in a way respond to our admiration and answer our questions about architectural design and history. These drawings are not interpretable architectural objects per se. It is because there is a group of people for whom these objects count as interpretable that objects matter, that they talk back to us, and they are interpretable only in the context of this particular society of friends. The introduction to touch the Chandigarh drawings, the moment of no, set an important epistemological problem for me as an anthropologist to find out what counts as legitimate communication with the objects and their makers. The no that paralyzed my senses caused me to reflect, and later yet to begin this project, the project that I'm presenting today, and to trace the secret life of drawings and models found in architecture archives and collections. The no I heard in the votes followed me through the study, but it also denoted an acute awareness of the importance of archives of all sorts, and therefore the need to protect them. So within the no, you can actually detect several voices, several undertones. There's a distant voice that says, don't damage, don't destroy the drawings. And another one that says, we care, we are aware of its importance. So there's two undertones slowly synchronized together, and they show attention to preservation on the one hand and worry about distraction on the other. What suspended my innocent iconoclastic gesture that I was about to perform was a statement of care and love for the architecture objects, and also outlined the awareness of their archival value. So it is precisely that subtle balance between preservation and distraction that defines an architectural institution, and perhaps a lot of archival institutions like the CCA, but it's about how the CCA manages to control the fine balance between ideolatry and iconoclasm that defines the specificity of the CCA as an institution. And this is a thread that runs through many practices in this institution, and this is a thread that, an argument that I've heard in different ways, and it was taught in different ways by Mirko, Giovanna, Martin, and many other people I have interviewed, which told me in an oral history way the stories about the specificness of this institution. The second walk is a walk in the vaults with Giovanna. Sorry, Giovanna, you're on the pictures again. It's 2016, June, and it's we visit the vaults with Giovanna, but this time this is part of a longer of my longer project, which started with a lot of interviews. So the visit comes almost at the end of a long series of interviews, and we look at some of the boxes and some of the documents. And this happens to be, well, this is by chance, a box with the archive of Cedric Price, so no vocal introductions to touch. I'm told, yes, you can touch, so you can engage. Not with all the objects, but there was an invitation to engage rather than a vocal no. No barriers between me and the 1970 world of Cedric Price. In the archive, we witnessed the microcosm of Cedric Price's architecture. And we engage in a long discussion with Giovanna about the structure of these boxes. She tells me there are 18 similar boxes like this one, and I start thinking, when I say box, and when I see boxes like this, then I started thinking about the OMA, and that's another situation in which the OMA knowledge and the connection with what a box is there. The boxes are usually much larger. They're full of all sorts of materials, foam cutters, for pieces of foam, different experimental models and documents, whereas in the CCA we have the thin boxes, much more elegant thin boxes, because they contain files and documents, and very similar to what architects call working archives. And that's another situation. At that moment, when we started comparing the boxes, I realized the dialogue with the OMA case was there. And the analytics, some analytics traveled from the previous cases of ethnographic work from the OMA to the CCA, and it was inevitable to have them in this dialogue. I didn't mean to transport anything, it just happened, and this dialogue was there. Traces, there were, of course, traces of my own reactions, Giovanna's reaction and astonishment, of my own assumptions of what's there. This is all information that we gain because we are around the boxes of with Cedric Price's archive, including the ontological disturbance. So all these voices are there, and they all infused my ethnographic note-taking and the recording of the interview. The interviews and my writing, and I decided to keep all those voices and to integrate them all in the narrative. This, of course, leads to a narrative that will become much more thicker, ontologically thicker, so to say, because it will bear the ontological thickness of many reverberations of past fieldworks, foldable times of writing, voices and noises, echoes, and this will, in a way, help me to avoid the standard purifications that we witness both in historiographical and ethnographic writing today. Then we continue to open the different boxes and look at the different folders, the McCaplin report, different documents in the box. We flip through the different chapters of this report. All sorts of surprising things come out of the box, different images, military images, letters, that were sent to Cedric Price as a response to, he wanted a specific quote. There were different magazines, trade catalogs, pictures of animals. We'll look at different projects, the nasty letters, the calculations, the quotes, the magazines, the trade catalogs, numbers, images, and you start to wonder, what is this there? This is a box full of marvelous objects, of wonders in a way, because they're all heterogeneous. The heterogeneity is related to the fact, as Mirko Zardini argues, architects are not the best people to deal with the archives, and the archives is what is left of a lot of actions, and a lot of material is lost or destroyed. So what appears to me as an amazing collection, as a collection of wonders, as an amazing collection of marvelous things that come out of this box. We hear from Mirko is rather a selection that bears traces of destruction and hazards. The boxes we open testify, however, for the original ambition of the CCA to collect material that will be able to reveal the process of thinking, the experimentation in design. And not just the final result of architecture making. So in the visit, we also witness the organization of the archive of the collection. We can look at different acquisition numbers, the project numbers, the serial numbers, the letters and the codes, and the code reflect the different internal organization of the material. All these codes and numbers suggest order. And the codes and the numbers also tell me a history of the collection. So the object itself, the box itself also adds a layer of oral history that I can hear, of course, with the help of Giovanna, I don't have the box talking to me, of course. I can hear this in combination with every other type of story that I have heard and collected as a part of this study. We also witness similar documents and similar versions and copies in addition to the original, and this is another aspect that fascinates me, to see that all the copies are kept, that there is not just an attention to the original, but all the copies and irregularities and repetitions are kept in the box. And reading the internal organization and repetitions is important for the archivists and the curators to recollect the process of design. So we can begin to grapple the implicit sense of order behind the apparent disorder. When flipping through these repetitive documents, we understand that when the CCA collects archives, they collect design process. And that is what this box tells me about the institution. That's a voice added to the other oral histories. The study of the box also tells me when you collect an archive, you capture this heterogeneous nature of design, repetitive, contingent, and relational nature of design. When you interpret an archive, you collect and make sense of design process. And I was thinking that if at the OMA I witness how architects produce messiness and creative disorder, at the CCA, the creative disorder in the archive tells a story about the design practice that produced it. We also witness the entire network behind Cedric Price, and we consider the technologies of the time, the development of Britain, so everything is there in this box as well. Documents about mobile electricity or lighting, economic relations, the economic rationale behind costing specific technologies. And again, when you open this box, all these objects, their times and spaces all at once come out of the box and they speak to you. A world is there, a world is in a box. So the context, I started thinking as an architectural theorist, is not artificially isolated there. It is rather there, that it's part of the whole process of thinking, visualizing, and assembling the ingredients needed to imagine an architectural object. And it's by flipping through the materials in a box that we get to grasp the contextual mutations that happen simultaneously as the architectural thinking of a project develops. So all this kind of purification, again, that we have in architectural theory and history, the context is here, the architecture is produced there, are constructions, falsification. We see what we see here in the box, that there's something completely different coming out of this relationship. In a methodological, as a methodological note, we see that oral history is not told by people, but it's about stories or versions of history, of institutional history, told true stories by specific people in specific contexts, and always in relation to their activities, and always in relation to the specific objects they work with on a daily basis. And this is an image from the office of Giovanna, where we see how these objects are extremely important for the cognitive and material practices of a curator. Objects tells us this story, and we cannot isolate the discourse from the objects and the stories they retell. How do we capture these stories? How do we capture an institutional rhythm? We observe, we record, and analyze at the same time. And these are not autonomous operations. They all happen at the same time. When I record an interview here, I always observe, record, and observe and already analyze what is happening in the specific situation of observation. How we capture the meaning of what we see, we guess the meaning, we assess the guesses, and we draw explanatory conclusions from the better guesses. Ethnographic writing as a result, and ethnographic writing is based on all these stories and oral histories, including the observations, is an actor-oriented writing and is based on actor-oriented descriptions, and that's why I need to bring all these people in the stories and all these people that I quote today, because the construction because ethnographic writing and storytelling is about constructing a reading of what happens in connection with specific people and what they say they do. And it's a fictitious and imaginative act as well. Which leads me to the third scene, and it's a situation where I have been told no many times. You will have to guess where we are. I will just show you a couple of images. And it's perhaps a space you have visited during your visit of the CCA. So what does this look like? You already know the answer. This is the conservation lab at the CCA, which we rarely see unless we do an ethnography or an oral history of the institution. So we cannot trace, we cannot capture an institution only on the basis of official discourses. We cannot trace an institutional history on the basis of official discourses. We trace and follow different practices, and that is the reason why from the votes and the two scenes that happened in the votes, I had to move to the conservation lab. There I found myself entirely enchanted by the lab's quasi-scientific modus operandi. There's something puzzling in the environment here, evoking the procedural technicality that the production of architectural models and drawings require. At the same time, there's something puzzling, dazzling, and enigmatic and indecipherable. So there are strange things happening in this space. As you have seen, there are lots of microscopes and instruments, and what we witness under the microscope of the conservators between scalpels and chemicals, the magnifying glasses and the tracing paper, is a relationship played out between ideolatry and iconoclasm. The environment of the conservation lab is reminiscent of a medical lab where objects such as tissues, tissue samples or blood are treated like patients in need of special care. The use of quasi-medical terminology is striking. Conservators examine, they deal with active things, they tell me. They do condition reports, and the report has to be signed so that they can send the object for treatment. They examine the object under the microscope and then have to assign the treatment. They predict different risks, for instance, from falling apart, risks of mold or infestation, and then point to the different witnesses in an object. Just this is like very similar to the examination report. Again, we have in a medical context, and then they perform the treatments of the patients they have. The treatments are extremely meticulous, and of course they require lots of instruments and tests, and they take care of the objects. They produce different protocols and reports, and then I can continue for hours just on this aspect of their practices. So for instance, Karen and David, the conservators I met in the lab, tell me without irony that I'm quoting, "We are doing a full health and security check of the objects here." And of course they perform surgeries in case an object needs a treatment. So preservation of architectural objects and models as well, also not just the drawings but also the models. So preservation of architectural objects requires description, careful identification and scrutiny in terms of analyzable properties rather than in terms of aesthetic effects. So here again, like in the vaults, the aesthetic judgment is suspended. There's no, we are not in the regime of valuation of objects. We are not in the aesthetic regime at all. Objects identified carefully and are examined with scrutiny in terms of analyzable properties, and there is a dialogue, there's no dialogue with the value or with the intrinsic properties of the object at all. At any moment in this study, I did not witness people admiring those objects, valuing these objects for their exemplary properties in a kind of state-performed culture of preservation. What we witness, rather, is a practical regime of engagement in an elaborate exercise designed to make architectural drawings and models speak. Behind closed doors, archivists are concerned with the ephemeral nature of architectural objects as material and cognitive entities. Far from loading the durability of expressive forms or finding threads of continuity through time and by extension through architectural history, they simply converse with objects. They take care of them, make them coherent and ready to talk. Which leads me to some tentative conclusions of this study, still work in progress. As we have seen the last decades, we witness a very conscious effort by architectural practices to consider archives, and many architects grew awareness and concern about their legacy. Contrary to what theorists say, that architecture as a practice is resistant to being archived, I here quote La Trobe, and that architects are singularly adept in erasing their past. My study of the archival and curatorial intelligence of the CCA outlines a different trend. Architects keep traces of recent past, traces of practice. Architects grow awareness of the importance of archives. The world witnessed in the vault through these very shortly accounted scenes, the world in an archival box or the world witnessed in a conservation lab makes us question the nature of the objects we see and makes us wonder what we have in our hands or what we see. We often wonder, is this a design object or is this a technological object? In the Cedric Price box, for instance, and that's why I spend so much time on this. You often see an object and you wonder, well, is it indeed an architectural object, or is it symbolic, or is it a technological object? Is it in the conservation lab, is it a medical, or is it an architectural aesthetic object? So there is this kind of questioning of the nature of the objects we see. Is it social or is it design? These documents, all these documents and models that we see, are hybrid, and in these hybrids, design and society compete with one another and end up merging. Bearing amazing resemblance to the medieval collections full of wonders, and here I'm only talking about the collection because obviously the CCA is a research institution and has a curatorial program, and we cannot take this metaphor Wunderkammer to all the activities in this institution, but only to those very specific scenes that I have described, which if we describe them with ethnographic attention, we are in the regime of wonder. We are in the regime of the Wunderkammer here. The architectural collection, in a way, the architectural collection as witnessed through these different scenes, appears to me as they appear as sites of treasures, of a very specific, very different from the modern museums. Yet the special assortment of things, of design rarities, is not that of a simple inventory contained in an early modern Wunderkammer. In the collection, we witness the simultaneous appearance of design and society, their architecture objects and social processes first rarefy and ultimately merge. So context is part of the archival units. It comes out of the box. It's never outside the vault. It's never outside those boxes. In these hybrids, either society had begun the work of architecture or architecture extends the work of society. So it is the mutual imitation of the design and the social that is wondrous in these objects, not the objects by themselves. So the wonders collected and displayed by this institution inspire also new orderings of things and transform the ontological categories of design and society as mobilized in architectural thinking, as well as, I think, the conceptual apparatus of design history and theory. The collapse of the opposition, design on the one hand, society on the other, which we witness by tracing the ontological complexity of archival objects here, will have and already has an impact on the way we tell design history. Here we find ourselves in a macrocosm that is not intended to represent the entire architectural heritage. All archives, all objects ever produced by all great architects, it is not a macrocosm in miniature either, it's a microcosm. The objects are not samples of architectural styles or patterns of creativity, nor do they obey a strict classification principle. A variety is presented here, not the universality. As Phyllis Lambert explains this herself, she was not interested in collecting or documenting the built environment, but she was rather interested in the experiments in architecture, in the experimental side of architecture. Walking in the vaults or in the lab, as I did with your help, we can witness that particular aspect of the CCA here, the CCA collection is about experimentation indeed, is about thinking in architectural terms like we think in English or in Portuguese or in French. It's a language. And this explains also in a way, as Martin also says, that this is an archive of people that build less but think more. So this kind of thinking aspect, the cognitive, the cognitive and material aspect of architecture making is what fascinated me from the very start, and the process-oriented nature of the CCA collection is for me reminiscent to the nature of the many objects I have witnessed in architectural practices as an ethnographer of architecture in the last years. So this connection is for me there, and I constantly invite previous analytics from previous fieldworks to come and dialogue with what I see in order to help me understand this experimental dimension of design. All these objects, as Mirko frames this, offer enough material for the understanding of the evolution of the process of the architectural thinking. They enter the CCA not just to be valued, researched or exposed, but also as resources that can ignite new ideas, as ways of nurturing further design creativity, as a way of enacting intellectual debate and producing a new discourse on architecture, as a way of generating a new cultural climate around architectural thinking. So the archive is not the grand finale of a designer in a designer's career, making gloriously the entrance of a star architect or a writer or a practice into a memorable history with big H, history of architecture. It is rather a diagrammatic tool, a very active diagrammatic tool. So here in this place, we're in the very heart of the Deleuze, the diagrams described by Deleuze, of this kind of machines of forces and thinking. And I will end with this argument. If the purpose of museums, for instance, is to educate and conserve or to glorify certain objects, or to present them to an audience for educational purposes, the CCA is a very different institution, because the CCA puts this object or takes this object out of the kind of tranquility of architectural history. The objects here are not safely stored in the archive of the history of architecture, again with big H, but these objects are here rather challenged, reactivated, and used in a way, in a diagrammatic way. As both Mirko and Giovanna often explain to me, the CCA exhibits and research publications are tools for developing the collection. Thus, in an intriguing, in a paradoxical way as well, the CCA does not deal with an archive, in the Foucauldian sense of archive, as a history of architectural forms, of static objects. It's not an archive of static objects either, but it's rather a diagram as a becoming of forces, as a socio-temporal multiplicity. Its specificity is to put into action a number of forces to actualize the diagrammatic multiplicity of the archive. In this activation, curators, archivists, conservators, and other practitioners here deal with bits of matter that is unfinished, unformed, and unorganized. That is a diagram, a cartography, an abstract machine, profoundly unstable and fluent, quoting here Deleuze, constantly brewing matter and functions so as to constitute mutations. And that is exactly what happens here. The CCA collection is not static, but rather continuously evolving and developing, inter-social, and in becoming. It never functions to represent a pre-existing world of architecture, context, and culture. It rather generates a new type of reality, a new model of truth. Not a subject of architectural history, but overhanging history. The CCA does not store design objects, it makes design history. It doubles architectural history with a becoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Albena, for giving insight into, but also performing institutional storytelling through both observation and oral history, I would claim. And the response is with Janina Gosset.
Thank you very much, Albena, for presenting work in progress, which is sometimes a quite challenging task. Throughout your presentation, I started wondering if to a certain extent what you were trying to look for was what Polanyi calls tacit knowledge about thinking and design, how archival practices are produced. And then I started thinking if what you're trying to bring to the fore is tacit knowledge in how these institutions work. I wondered particularly because we've been looking at oral history this week, why specifically you chose OMA, the CCA, because of course, as you pointed out in your lecture, these are exceptional institutions, and they set to a certain extent, they're very similar to other design practices, archival institutions.
They're not.
To a certain extent, I said, but they also set themselves apart.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to get at thinking in design, why would you look at those that are exceptional rather than those that are kind of everyday? Because in oral history, we know that we're trying to get at the everyday. That's the origins of oral history, where they said it was more likely to interview, that a fishmonger was more likely to be interviewed in Britain at a certain point than a member of parliament. And just through that thinking of oral history, why do you then choose institutions that are explicitly different if what you're trying to get at is the tacit knowledge of thinking and design? And then as a related question, I also wondered, how does your ethnography then particularly sets itself apart from oral history, or how does it rely to what does oral history, what role does oral history play in it? This sort of question.
Right, thank you. It's not tacit knowledge. It's over-explicated knowledge that we rarely question. Yeah, it's knowledge that we all have. I wouldn't really call it tacit knowledge because it's knowledge that is shared by practitioners, but it's never questioned, right? And we never explain, we never tell the stories. And in that sense, I would disagree that because these are exceptional institutions. Yeah, they are exceptional, but who will read a book about any architectural practice? If it's a book about OMA, yes, you'll read it. Mm-hmm. And it's not for practical reasons. It's because of, and we discussed this in the afternoon, it's not the duration of a field work that matters, it's not the number of the interviews that matters, it's the intensity of the practices, and it's the intensity of the activities that you witness. And in exceptional institutions like the CCA or like the OMA, you have this intensity of work. You have a lot going on. You have a lot of projects. And there's not a better place to capture this intensity. In that sense, I wouldn't say that if you go in any archival institution, you'll get the different stories because their voices are not heard. Or if you go in any practice, and of course I have been criticized about my OMA work, why Rem Koolhaas is not even present in the books, because I gave the opportunity to all those little designers or designers that produce a design on a daily basis to speak, and they have never been interviewed before. They were even surprised that I was interested in talking to them and following the activities and the design in the making, and often they told me, nobody asked us these questions before, because they were never asked. It's always this kind of quick interview with the star architect, and then you go. And the same in the CCA. So I don't know how many ethnographers you had in this institution before, but I have interviewed many people who were and everyone was very helpful and happy to talk to me, because some of these people were never, and that's why I call it the invisible CCE, were probably never sort of interviewed on the activities, and that's why for me it's to understand the complexity of an institution like the CCA, we need to travel to all those places that are usually not seen and to capture all these voices, or even the voices of the registered people, because they tell me an institutional story. Their version of the CCA is perhaps very different from the version of Mirko, Giovanna, Lev, Tom, and the other people, Adria, and the other people I see in the room. And everyone has a different angle, because this angle is the angle of their practice. It's a very specific lens. It's the lens of their daily practices, of their daily existence in this institution, and that's why we cannot tell an oral history. We cannot produce a history based on the discourses only, but it's through the lens of the practice and this very specific relationship to the object that matter to those people whose voices are never heard, or at least are not taken into the account, so that we can produce a picture, the overall picture in an institution. And Albert, sorry I didn't have a picture of you in the and Mary too.
have half an hour for questions. There's a microphone over there which can travel a bit. This can travel too. I would ask everybody who is speaking to briefly introduce her or himself. So, are there questions?
Hi there. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering if I could ask you to expand a little bit more about how you opened your presentation with quick versus slow methods, and how that's been applied to the CCA in terms of how do you define what's long or what's slow in this case, and in terms of visiting, say, the different labs, do you think that a slow approach would be visiting these labs multiple times with multiple projects? And if so, it wasn't apparent to me from what you've presented if that's something that you have done or are going to do. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That's an important question indeed. So a quick study of the CCA would have taken me perhaps, I don't know, one afternoon or 2 afternoons, and would have probably I would have probably done just a quick tour, some images, and perhaps interviews only with Giovanna and Mirko and perhaps Phyllis, yeah. So a long study for me, again, it's not in terms of the duration or the number of visits or the a long study will require gaining more experience, getting to see more people, the different practices and the different aspects of the curatorial and archival practices in the CCA. And it's indeed very different format than the OMA study, which was a 2-year ethnography, and it was based in the OMA. So I was there all the time. But even when you are there all the time, yeah, there are moments, it's always a fragmented, long but fragmented type of study, because you cannot be there 12 hours a day. You cannot be there day and night. Sometimes I would, in the OMA study in particular, sometimes I would stay for a whole day waiting for an important discussion to take place, and then it just doesn't happen, and then I go home, and then I come back in the morning, and there's a different project on the table of models, because they had this meeting at, I don't know, 11 o'clock in the evening, and then decisions were taken, and then you come in the morning and there's a different project. So sometimes, even if you wait there, and if you're there for a long period of time, you can always miss the important moments, and that's why I think of long and slow ethnography in terms of capturing those important key moments, the intensity of the work, and speaking to many people as possible, talking to many people as possible, and following those projects. For the conservation lab, well, their practices, again, you cannot disturb, because observation, interview, of course, everyone will make time for the interview, and this institution has been extremely generous in terms of allowing me to stay here and interview people around, but you have to be careful not to disrupt, not to bother, not to interrupt. Everyone is busy, so in an interview situation, you stay in an interview for 1 hour, and this time is there for you. In an ethnographic observation, you're always interrupted, and it always fragmented, no matter how long it is. And in that sense, that's why the intensity and the important projects and the key moments matter more rather than the duration. Yeah.
How do you know when you're done?
Well, that's a very important question as well. My mentor used to say, when you have written 300 pages, then you stop, because you can follow a process, an institution, networks, or follow the actors forever. I mean, yeah, and in particular this institution, because I was following the other architect, the exhibit on, and some of the interesting discussions around the curatorial concept. But then there were many other exhibits afterwards. So can I possibly capture all these dynamics, especially in an institution like this? There's so many interesting things. Then it becomes a book only about this, and it's never ending. So there's some kind of frameworks in a way. Either you run out of time, or run out of budget, or in a dissertation project you just have to submit after 3 or 4 years, and then it's over. Or when this, on a more serious note, when this intensity is captured, and then when you feel, so for instance, a project is running very intensively, or there's an important discussions in the conservation lab, and then when you feel that you have captured this intensity and you know what the activities are about, and you know more about the specificity, and then it becomes repetitive. And when you feel it's repetitive, there's no point of staying longer or asking more questions or doing another interview. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. It's always a pleasure to meet you and hear you talk. I mean, for me, it has been a privilege because I actually heard 2 different lectures and met you 2 different times at different institutions in different cities within less than 9 months or so, I think. First, a comment about what you said, kind of revealing what Mirko told you about architects and how they're not the perfect people to sort of deal with the archives. They can certainly produce them, and we know of all these architects that very meticulously archive themselves and their practices. Perhaps they don't know what to do with this after they have produced it. As a young teacher, we have conducted an experiment with Kurt Foster, who was involved in this institution many years ago. We kind of took the students to the archives at Yale, and we saw the kind of spark that this generated once they actually became engaged in the actual objects, and what kind of work came out of that in comparison to previous generations of students. So I know that architects definitely can deal with the archives. I mean, they're visual learners, so they can do, architects in the making perhaps know very well how to deal with this sort of things. Now, I want to come back to the let's see, what's the word you used? Transparticular knowledge issue, and how your work for OMA kind of came back into this work that you were doing for the CCA. At some point you mentioned the term fluid hierarchy or something like that. I can see how that applies and how that would spark your interest in an office as OMA, which is famously non-hierarchical, which means that it's kind of messy too. But I think there you were referring to people. I'm under the impression that if you were to apply this fluid hierarchy theory or method or interest at the CCA, rather than the structure of rather how the departments are organized and operated and managed, would you say that this fluid hierarchy kind of goes back to the objects themselves and how they communicate whatever historical value they have, or generate what you very beautifully said, that kind of project their value into the future, and they become material for future engagements with design?
Yeah, I don't think I said hierarchy. I said maybe fluidity or flatness. Right. Yeah, which, but I think our argument is probably on the flatness, right? On the flatness side, because OMA is famously flat, yeah, and officeless. So that's a one room space, whereas here we have a different institutional structure. But again, my method is, and you have captured this wonderfully, my method is to follow the different objects and to retrace those trajectories through, of course, interviews and observations, by connecting interviews, well, discursive and non-discursive knowledge. And there is one aspect which is important, and that's why I admire the decision of Mirko and Giovanna to invite me today. The ethnographic accounts of practitioners we produce are not necessarily accounts that practitioners will agree with. And I have always had the disagreement of architects from OMA. After the work was recognized, I always had someone in the room telling me, no, it's not like this. Well, I know Rem Koolhaas, I met him once, and it's not like this that design happens in this office. Or I will have someone else who tells me, yeah, actually it's not what we do with models. And there was always disagreements, because you cannot capture the totality of an institution. You cannot capture every single aspect or a certain structure that is there either in an institutional kind of hierarchy or structure. You cannot capture everything. You're only there for a certain number of months or days, and you see what you can see and witness, and it's about this specificness, about what you see and how you connect the discourses and how you capture the specific nature of the institution through objects, maybe other, because I'm formed in this tradition. I'm Latourian, Orthodox Latourian, la lettre, so I follow the objects, and for me they mean something. For instance, I could have decided not even to talk about those boxes because I have rich information from interviews about the specific approach to archives or about the specific approach to restoration. Why would I even visit the conservation lab? And why would I visit it more than once? Yeah, if I was not interested in in talking about this specific relationship to objects, if I was not interested in hearing the voices of the objects and adding this layer so that I can recollect the institutional specificity. Yeah.
Hi, again. I'd like to ask you something about that you were saying. I'm sorry, you were saying like things really fast sometimes. I don't know if I missed it, but you said that there is a kind of gap in the theory and criticism field of architecture, where like the texts and the works, like when they are like analyzing, there is a kind of like gap between text and work. And you said also that you cannot do oral histories with based on discourses. So these are actually two huge statements, and at least as far as I could understand. So my question is, can you explain better and like be specific, like with these statements? Thank you.
Yeah, well, and this kind of connects to the first comment of oral history. This is an expression I never use, I'm sorry, oral history, but I try to reflect on it in connection with your seminar. I wouldn't even say that the interviews, well, they provide some kind of oral history of the institution, but I wouldn't frame it as history at all. Maybe they will be read because I have piles of interviews here, which I promised to give to Mirko and Giovanna, and this will become some kind of trace of this specific moment of retracing or recollecting the institutional specificness of CCA. They will document one particular moment, one particular fragment of this history. They will be perhaps read as oral history, yeah. But for me, this is one of the sources I use, one of the many ingredients in my methodology will be these interviews, which in a way tell alternative stories from many different perspectives, where we hear more than one voice or more than three different voices. And in that sense, I would probably not even term this oral history, although this could be read as oral history, yeah, in the future. I don't know if this answers. Maybe you can develop your second question more.
My second question? The first question was about the gap between the text and work. So if you want to...
The tension between text and words. Text and...
Work?
Sorry.
Sorry. The object, yeah.
The spoken and... Right, yeah. You mean the discursive and non-discursive, the gestures and the words?
No, I'm sorry. It's about, you said that theory and criticism, there is a really like how architects are doing like research. It seems that there is a gap between what actually they are writing and between what the sources that they are consulting, the objects, and you show like made some gestures showing the archives. So that's my question, like, it's a statement that you said that there is a gap, and I was just like wondering why you say that, and where is this gap? You know, like in which scholarship? U.S., Canada. That's my main question. In which area? That's my question.
All right. Do you refer probably to the start of the lecture when I talked about the quick epistemological approach? Yeah, well, because that's what happens very often in architectural criticism, and I have seen this with previous ethnographic projects, that especially in the Koolhaas ethnography, very often they were telling me, why do you waste your time? Why you just go and you interview Rem? You've already spoken to Rem. Why would you waste your time, talking to more people? You just go back and you could produce an article on the basis of what this star architect or one person, a dominating voice, which will reproduce a dominating discourse, will say. Why would you spend more time? And this time, again, in relation to your question, the duration is, the intensity and the duration of the study is important, because you gain experience and you actually witness what happens in a practice, what happens in an institution like the CCA, what are the different rhythms, what are the different activities, how objects travel, and then you start connecting the discourses, not just of one but many people, and what they tell you with what they do. And it's in the connection between, for instance, what we say design is about, and when we do what we do when we say design is this. So connecting the words, the discursive, with the gesture and with what we do, then that's where we generate different meaning. And that's extremely important for me from an anthropological perspective too, because this is additional information, and I think we started this discussion already with your presentations in the afternoon, because you cannot ignore what you see, what you hear, what you witness ethnographically in an institution. This also tells you a lot about the institution, about how people behave, how they move, how they connect to objects, how they worry, in which moments they're happy and they cry because the project has failed and the mayor of New York has decided not to go ahead with this project. All these little details which are part of the climate, of the kind of working climate in an architectural practice or in an institution like the CCA, you capture them through these connections between discursive and non-discursive. So if I tell you, this again goes back to James and the pragmatists, if I tell you, I'm very happy to be here, would you believe me? So you look at the face expression, the gesture, you connect it with everything. You say, this is also information on the discourse. You cannot isolate the discourse. You cannot transcribe an interview, take this as a discursive information, and then interpret it by entirely cutting it off from the context where it was produced, from the gestures, from all the kind of non-verbal, non-discursive information that is part of an interview situation, and that is part of an ethnographic study. Yeah.
So following on from what you were just saying, to what extent do you write yourself into the ethnography? The effect that you have on the people you interview and the gestures that you elicit?
Yeah, I'm there all the time.
So you consciously write yourself, and just as you were telling the story about, I tried to do this, and that leads into
exactly, yeah, of course you need to remain at different distances from what, and again back to the discursive and the flatness and the flexibility aspect that were mentioned. You cannot take a full distance. If you are there, if we're in the quick mode of interviewing, you go there, you do the interview, you go back. If you are there for more than one interview, if you're there for longer, if you also witness people doing things, you are involved, you are fascinated. And this fascination, of course, that's what keeps you stay longer in an institution, but that's also what produces an engaging, hopefully the book will be engaging and interesting to read, an engaging story about what it means to produce an archive, how architectural objects, drawings and models become archival units, and how complex the activities of an institution like this are, because objects travel in a very intriguing way through this institutional flatness, and they eventually become archives. Yeah.
Hi, Albena. Thanks very much for your talk. I had lots of questions, but this one's just popped into my head, so I'm going to ask it, and it's slightly different because it takes us out of kind of an academic framework in a way. And you've used words like storytelling and just now engaging and sort of so a sense of kind of a rich, enjoyable story that you can tell about an institution. And what came into my mind suddenly was the kind of obsession that we have culturally with kind of fly-on-the-wall documentaries. So where we go into an institution for 8 weeks to a hotel. I mean, and these are the ones I'm thinking of in the UK, whether it's a hotel, whether it's someone's home, whether it's, I think it was one at the airport and so on. And so we're at the current moment kind of in love with these sorts of stories. And I wanted to understand a bit whether you think there's a kind of a turn or a shift and an interest in the kind of work you do that's not just academic, but sort of broader cultural phenomena, or in some way is what you're doing very different to that, and if so, yeah, how and yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think in the last 10-15 years, I would say, in architecture, there is more and more interest in ethnographic methods, in kind of engaged inquiries in architecture, and this is related, I would say, to a number of dialogues that happened in architecture, the dialogue with cultural anthropology, the work in particular Donald Schoen and Dannekoff, which I mentioned, which are very much North American, but there were no studies of architecture in the making, and especially recent studies of architecture in the making in Europe until very recently. So I think there is some kind, in a way, a growing awareness of the importance to account the complex and social, the social construction aspect of architectural production, the complex and heterogeneous aspect of architecture in the making, especially in the last years. For me, I don't know whether this is part of the trend, because I look at it from a disciplinary perspective and within the field of architecture, because I'm myself trained in anthropology and sociology, and I have been in the field of architecture for the last 15-16 years. So for me, it's a natural dialogue that happened in my discipline. But I think it becomes more and more important, this dialogue and how we export it into other fields like architectural criticism and architectural history becomes extremely important. And there the question of distance, of fly on the wall, of taking different distances from what we observe, how we engage, to what extent we are present, how we invest our knowledge, and how we take into account those different voices. That could be captured in a documentary, but not necessarily in historiographic writing, for instance, how we purify
popular culture. So I mean, so whether you would think that there is a relationship between this kind of work and then what we see, there's huge appetite, I suppose, for it. So I mean, just on TV, sort of, probably every evening you can turn something on which is exploring an institution in this quite slow, attentive, back of house sort of way. So, I understand what you're saying from within the discipline, but I just wondered if there's if there's a relationship or a non-relationship. Not
an obvious one for me. Yeah,
I see.
Yeah, because then a documentary doesn't capture. Well, Francisco will know this better. A documentary cannot be based on a very, very slow ethnography, can't it? So there are some difficulties in terms of, differences in terms of what we produce at the end. So this is going to be a book which at the moment is 80 pages, and could grow longer. So then obviously the story I tell and the stories I tell in this book will be of different nature than a documentary. Than what could be told in a popular way.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question regarding you frame your work as the history of objects that travel. So if we read, let's say, the outcome, the book that's going to come out of this research, it will inform us about the history, let's say, how objects travel in this institution. But my question is, as you are dealing with archival objects, and we as architectural historians deal with archival objects on a very regular basis, would your research also aim to inform our reading of those objects, or is like a detached history of?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we were already having some discussions in the afternoon about this. And I was presenting some of this work also to historians who often tell me, in a kind of informal way, because I'm still testing the ground to see who might be interested in that kind of account of archive, of the making of archives, and they tell me this could be an interesting and informative study for the work they do, because from a historical perspective we're often interested in the information we can get from an archive, but never in the making of an archive, never in those complex trajectories of objects and people and the stories that we have and all the work that has been done for an object to be there in the exhibition rooms upstairs, and how this object came to the CCA, what kind of curatorial decisions had to be taken and had to be made, how this object traveled and was preserved in the conservation lab and then traveled through many other labs in this institution in order to go there, and then it continues and goes somewhere else, and then it travels through institutions. So if we look at this lens, so not at the smaller level, at the kind of big institutional level, because here we talk about an institution, but I look at this institution from a very microscopic perspective. I'm at the level of, looking at the hands and the gestures and what happens at this level, not at the kind of macroscopic, or that's what Deleuze will call molar, the molar constructs and then the molecular. I'm at the molecular level. And if I follow those objects and trajectories on the molecular level, I will be able to retrace this complex and I hope fascinating history of making an archive work, and how it then travels and reaches other audiences and travels between institutions, and this kind of story, which we rarely tell. This kind of stories we rarely tell. We remain at the surface. We go to the archive. We remain at the quick search, quick research level very often in terms of epistemology. Yeah.
So you have your reading as a researcher, how a different work. Let's say I'm interested in the paper or the project. So my question is, if let's say if the one of the aims of your project is to inform my reading
of Cedric Price,
not
for instance,
Price,
yeah, but for instance.
Yeah.
I doubt it will add more information on specific archives or specific architecture work, because I cannot spend 20 years on this project. Otherwise, I could have told stories that then could add more to historical knowledge and historical narratives. But if you were working on Cedric Price, for instance, you would be looking at this chapter, because this is a very long chapter where I as an anthropologist of architecture, I discover what is the kind of richness and the wonders in a box. You are a historian, and Giovanna also tells me, well, this might be self-explanatory or kind of obvious for people who work with archives on a daily basis. But then if this part is contains knowledge that you already have or you're familiar with, then when you see this object traveling to other places, then you will be surprised, and then you'll wonder, well, I didn't expect to see this object here, and then it travels there, and then when you reveal when you make the connection between the other sites or the other labs that I follow in the CCA, perhaps this will give new insights to someone who would be an expert in, for instance, reading Cedric Price's archive or knowing more about the ontology of an archival box than myself.
Sorry,
Yeah.
very short, I promise. If I may follow up, and perhaps that's what Katie was asking, but at some point, it just occurred to me, at some point you mentioned that these objects or these processes are non-static, very dynamic, fluid, and that's what we want to capture. And I thought, okay, maybe it's quite early in the research, but then you mentioned that, it's going to be a book, and I already have 380 pages or something like that. So I was wondering, since you revealed to us that it's going to be a book and a book only. How is this fluid, non-static condition and the very particularity of the materiality, the movements, the objects, this level, as you said very graphically, which I really liked. How is this communicated through, I mean, the narrative itself and the way you write might be very lively, but how is this communicated through a very singular, but at the same time, I mean, the book is kinetic in the sense that you take it, you move it, you can take it in your bag, you put it in your back pocket, depending what size it is, turn the pages, whatever. But how is this lack of static condition, this fluidity, how do you imagine, how have you visualized this being, you know, present in the book? Or is that an issue to you at all?
Oh yeah, it is, yeah. And thank you for this question, because this is a question I'm having on a daily basis, and that I was just sharing this with Mirko and Giovanna in the afternoon, that I don't want to write a book, kind of standard book, where you have the literature review at the start and then you have the standard chapters, but I imagine this, and that's how the book is constructed at the moment, chapters with different lengths. So I have a chapter with I have two pages chapter, which captures a very specific movement, and then I have longer chapters that account for longer stories and longer trajectories, and then convey a different dynamics, keeping always the kind of microscopic lens, and all the bibliography and all the literature review is in the footnotes. So it's, in that sense, it's very anthropological type of writing, and that's the kind of writing that I would like to have in the whole book, because otherwise then the microscopic level is becomes, I mean, difficult to understand. If then all these kind of microscopic facts become evidence in longer chapters and are constructed in a kind of traditional narrative, then it will become very static. And this is something I have been struggling a lot with. So I would like to make this interesting to read. And so far Mirko is telling me that it's interesting to read. So far it works.
We have time for one or two more questions, and I got signal that there's a question behind me.
Are we still introducing ourselves when we speak? My name is Stefan Popa, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Architecture Association.
Yeah.
I was wondering, thank you first of all for this very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you about the connections you see between the information extracted from oral history interviews and other types of records about a building. And one example would be information related to the localization of the CCA. How does this influence the way you look at and you approach an interview? I'm also interested in the way it's obvious in this presentation of today, the object you are looking at, it's not instrumental in the way you determine your research. This object could be stored, let's say, a bit in everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering what connections or what is this important, if you see the relationship with the place, with the local, with the urban context, national context, as defining your approach to such a study?
No, no. Although the CCA, although on Montreal, the context, the mandate of CCA is very present at the start of the book when I describe the specificity of this institution, it does not appear that much in the descriptions of the different activities, of the different movements of objects. So this context, so to say, is not that present in the specificity. And in that sense, of course, you can wonder, is that how archiving or preserving objects or curating an exhibit always happens? Yeah, when you read those descriptions, you can wonder, is that how it always happens? Yeah, but the descriptions are on the same time very specific, based on interviews and very specific cases, where the context and the contextual mutations are somehow there, although there's the kind of Canada, Montreal, how isolated the institution is physically, but how present it is intellectually in the galaxy of of architectural history and theory. This paradox is there in the contextual specificness. Yeah.
Because the title tracing the CCA is somehow implying specialization, specifics, some more specific approach to the local, right? To the localization of the building, if not the archive itself.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I need a different title then. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, one last question. Hi, I'm Michael. I'm a PhD candidate and a researcher here right now. I had a question about the particular kind of hybridity that you can bear witness to, and you've positioned yourself as the outsider, the anthropologist, who, in the same way that we speak architecture, you speak anthropology. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that you have been involved in different design meteors for approximately 15 years, and you mentioned that your assessment of this institution can't be separated from your experience at OMA, for instance. Yeah. And I'm wondering if there's ever a concern that you might be in some ways contaminated by an architectural language, and you might no longer be as capable of deciphering those key moments where the discourse and the gesture say opposing things. And in particular, in your talk, there were so many scalar understandings. So cosmos, microcosm, macrocosm, landscape. These are very spatial terms that have come to constitute your own language. So maybe you can speak to contamination of language.
I like this term. Yeah. Well, every single word is important indeed when you try to analyze an interview and then connect the discourses with the situation where they occur and with the specific objects that also talk. And my approach in learning and understanding this language, which I continue to learn, for me it's a disciplinary language, is to try to question first the people I talk to. Well, what do you mean by rehousing an archive, and what do you mean by putting this code on this particular folder? What do you mean this is treated on an object level but not on a body level? So to try to understand first and try to understand the infra language that is behind the concept, and this is what every researcher should do, no matter whether you are trained in anthropology or in architecture. You should question what's behind those concepts, what's behind this kind of molar concepts in the big discourses, so to say, and try to unpack and try to reach a simpler kind of a descriptive language that will talk with the infra language of the practitioners, and that has been my approach. So the terms that you mentioned, macrocosm and landscaping, they probably come naturally as some concepts at the end, but the way I describe those activities, and it pretty much follows the language of the practitioners themselves, and don't also explicate this language as we go through ethnographic description and interviews. That has been my approach. But I'm always happy when architects tell me, oh, you speak like an architect now. I take it as a compliment.
I would like to close on that note. Thank you very much, Albena Yaneva, and thank you everybody for your interest and for coming. There's future events here at the CCA. You find information on the website. It's continuing with public events on a Thursday night in 2 weeks, where we have Katie Lloyd-Thomas presenting her research here. Thanks.